For those who don't know, we do this for our web page so that people can watch the sermon online as well. Titled the sermon, "It's Your Job." Some years ago, there was a young boy, I think he was in the 3rd grade, and he wanted to do something to help the hungry people in his city. So he started a program called Hams for the Hungry. Just one boy started it, and within 4 years, he was raising $40,000 a year to buy hams to feed the hungry in his city. And the gospel story talks about the few giving what they have in order to serve the many. And there's another story of a young man who was about 13 years old at the time, and he read an article about Dr. Albert Schweitzer and his missionary work in Africa. And so this young boy was intrigued by the article, and he wanted to do what he could help in Dr. Schweitzer's ministry. And he had enough money, this young boy, to buy 1 bottle of aspirin. And so he called the United States Air Force, and he asked them if they would take that 1 bottle of aspirin, and when they flew over the town in Africa where Dr. Schweitzer had his hospital, to drop the bottle of aspirin, because he so desperately wanted to provide whatever help he could. Well, the media, local media and national media, picked up on this boy's willingness to buy 1 bottle of aspirin, because that's all the money he had, in order to help out this ministry. As a result of that, people from around the country donated to this cause. And they delivered over $400,000 worth of medical supplies to Dr. Schweitzer. And Dr. Schweitzer at the time said, "I didn't know that 1 child could accomplish so much." Well, that was years ago. That $400,000 at that time might be millions today, because it's been many years since that happened. 1 child. Our story from the scripture today is about these disciples who don't really have much, and they've pretty well given everything that they have in order to follow Jesus. And all of a sudden, in the story, Jesus has thousands of people to feed. And you know, sometimes when we preach on this particular passage of the Bible, we focus in on the miracle of how you could possibly feed 5,000 people from 5 loaves and some fishes. Maybe it would be a good focus, rather, to preach on the idea that these people gave all that they had, although it wasn't very much. And you know this story well. This crowd of people had followed Jesus into the wilderness. And evening was approaching. And Jesus knew that these people were getting hungry. And the disciples say, "Send them away. Let them go into the village and buy their food for themselves. This is not necessary. Jesus replies, you feed them. What a powerful statement. You feed them. What he is saying is, don't put the decision on my back. Do something about it. You feed them. It's your job. Let's kind of apply that to today's world. And we have some real good lifetime examples today throughout the world of hungry. There are some dismal statistics throughout this world of ours. There are 1 billion people or more in this world who live on $1 or less a day. Think of that. $1 or less a day. And some of those may be in Hidalgo County, Texas, for all we know. Every 6 seconds, one child in this world dies in hunger. One child in 6 seconds dies in hunger. And that's as a result of famine, natural disasters, and all the rest that can afflict people. We have more than 60 million refugees and displaced people around the world right here this very day. And you know, just kind of like Jesus when he was talking to the disciples, we can find ourselves wringing our hands and crying out, what are we to do? And then we hear Jesus say, you feed them. It's your job. There are so many people, we say, in need, and our resources are so little. What are we to do, Jesus? And Jesus says, don't put it on my back. You feed them. And we can't tell the master, as the disciples did, tell them to go away, Jesus. They're here. But oftentimes what we do is we don't tell him to let them go away. We ignore them. And we can use that worn out rationalization that people oftentimes use. Well, charity begins at home. Now, if you're talking about Hidalgo County as home, that's one thing. But all too often when people say charity begins at home, I'm afraid I know what home they're talking about. They're talking about their own home. And they don't hear the call from Jesus. You feed them. The voice of the Master is always there, saying with confidence and power, you feed them. It's your job. And you know, we live in a very rich world. It's a world that is amazing in its abundance, and no one is questioning the fact, and it is a fact, that the exploding population does threaten worldwide, third world countries. And it is no secret that there is a limit to the resources available in this world. We don't argue with that. If the people of China, for example, would use the world's resources to the extent per capita that we do here in the United States, the world's resources would be diminished very quickly. But you know, God has provided for this world. God will continue to provide, and God provides the resources necessary, but it's up to us to see that His resources are used wisely and distributed well. C.S. Lewis, in one of his writings one time, said that the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus just simply short-circuited something that happens regularly in nature. He fed the 5,000 from those loaves of wheat, basically, and fish. He short-circuited that, something that normally takes a long time in nature. For example, when wheat is in the field, it multiplies. When the fish are in the sea, they multiply. And if they didn't, there's a lot of nations of the world would go hungry because fish are their main staples. And we get bread from the wheat that has multiplied in the fields. Lewis suggests in his article that Jesus, through the creative power of the Father at work in him, simply speeded up that process of growth of the wheat and the fish and multiplication, and rather than multiplying them in the fields of the sea. You know, many argue about this particular passage in the scriptures where he fed the 5,000. There are those today who would argue that that's not the miracle. The miracle is that there were all these people out there for a lunch and that God had provided amply for everybody. But to get these people to share with one another, that's truly the miracle. And it is truly a miracle when we get people to share with one another. I think I've mentioned before that the average American gives to charity, including church, 2.5% of their income per year. And those are reports from the IRS. And I contend that there's not many people who are going to lie to the IRS on the low side. They're not going to say they give less than they really do for charity. And so the 2.5% is probably a pretty accurate. Even our own scriptures tell us for the church alone, they should give 10%. And so the miracle is indeed getting people to share what they have with those that they do not have. And yet Jesus says, you feed them. It's your job. As I say, we are a rich people. We live in a rich world. And we may not be rich to the extent that Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or some of those people are. Maybe the inheritors of the Sam Walton riches. We're not up there. I remember one time billionaire H.L. Hunt said he would starve to death if he had to live on $1 million a week. Warren Buffett is trying to get his billionaire friends to give away 50% of what they have. And he says he has great trouble getting them to do that. And so he thinks he ought to write a book called How to Live on $500 million. Tony Campolo is one of my favorite speakers and ministers and pastors. And he was once invited to a women's conference to give a major address. And these particular women had gathered together and they had raised quite a little bit of money for a charity. And they had a project goal they hadn't quite reached. And so as he was sitting there on the dais before he was to speak, the chairman of the organization asked him, would you mind saying a prayer that we can continue to raise the money we need to reach our goal for this charity? He didn't give her an answer, but when he stood up, he surprised her as well as some others. He wouldn't do it. What he said was, you already have all of the resources that are necessary to complete the project right here within this organization. It would be inappropriate, Tony Campolo says, to ask for God's blessing when in fact God has already blessed you with all the resources that you need in order to achieve the goal. The necessary gifts are already in your hands. And he said, as soon as we take this offering and underwrite this mission project, we will thank God for freeing us to be generous, responsible, and accountable stewards that we're called for as Christian disciples. And they did. They raised it. You know, Tony hit the nail right on the head. We all have the resources. It's a matter of getting our mindset to the point that, yes, we can. We can feed them. It's our job. In one of his books, Chuck Swindoll tells about an interesting lawsuit that happened in Massachusetts in the 1920s. It was about a man who had been walking along a pier on the ocean, and he tripped over a rope and he fell into the deep, cold water of the ocean. And he came up out of the water screaming for help, and then he sank down below the surface. His friends were quite a ways away, and they heard his cry for help, but they couldn't get to him. But there on the ocean shore was a man laying in a deck chair. And he kind of turned, and he saw the man and heard him cry for help. And he turned away, and he didn't pay any attention. The man went under again and drowned. The family of the man who drowned were so exasperated that the guy on the shore ignored the dead man's cry for help. They went to court and they sued him. The judge found him not guilty. They said he had no legal obligation to save that man's life. And he didn't. And we have no legal obligation to save those lives of those people who are so destitute. But there is a moral obligation, an obligation to do what Jesus tells us to do. It's your job. Feed them. You see, you and I can turn a deaf ear to the needs of the world, and we can callously say, let God feed them. God will do that. And I believe that God does to an extent, but God calls us to be his helpers. When Jesus fed the 5,000, there were those of his disciples who did not have much. But they said, here are our loaves and our fishes. Do with them as you will. There was a man who was packing a shipment of food to go to the poor people of Appalachia. And he was separating the beans from the powdered milk and the canned goods. And as he was separating this food, he saw a brown paper bag. And he reached down and he picked it up. And as he picked it up, a peanut butter jelly sandwich, an apple, and a cookie fell out of the bag. And he looked at the bag, and it had the name of Krista, room 107. Some grade school child had given up her lunch in order to feed the less fortunate. Jesus says to us, you feed them. This is an incredibly rich world we live in. We are rich people, even though most of us don't know it, and we serve a rich God, and that God says, you feed them. And when Jesus says, you feed them, I can see Jesus looking at you, and you, and you, and you, and me. He means all of us when he says, you feed them. He's looking at us to see which one of us is going to step forward and say, here, Jesus, these are my loaves and my fishes. Do with them as you will. Amen.